Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, and for the Irish, there's not much to celebrate. Ireland is undergoing a crisis, many crises, actually. And all these crises are manufactured. People increasingly understand this. None of these things happen in an isolated way from each other, nor are any of them accidents of history. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Ireland's immigration crisis. But I'm also talking about Ireland's emigration crisis. Now, I want to get to some facts. Back in 2008, and a couple of years after that, according to the statistics provided by the Irish government, there were some 450,000 Irish on the dole, as I say in that part of the world, on welfare because they could not find jobs. Now, about 5 years later, they started to lower the numbers until a couple of years ago, the official figure was that there were only 235,000 in that same position. The reason I make a point of underscoring this is because the excuse, and it's the excuse used by every country in Europe and in the United States, is that we need a massive immigration in order to fill positions, in order to keep the economy going. But in fact, in Ireland today, because someone did a very careful study and examined the government's figures once again and found out that there were a lot closer to 425,000 Irish, native Irish, indigenous Irish, Irish who were of that island and who had an Irish heritage, not the people they now call the New Irish. That there were some 425,000 still in that position because they were splitting the figures up into different categories. It led one to believe that the figures were much lower. In fact, when you added kids who were grossly underemployed or hired in some kind of government internship at rock bottom pay, and when you included this disabled, there were many, many people on the dole, very close to the figure at 2008, 9, 10. That's important. It's important because the government is simply lying. There is so much poverty in Ireland now that people are sleeping on the streets. They are homeless. And yet the government insists on bringing in massive numbers. This is not a handful of people. In fact, those numbers are going up and going up steadily. So much so that Ireland, and this is part of a government project called Ireland 2040, they are going to grow the population there by 1 million people. And they're not going to be native Irish, because in 1 year they documented that a grand total of 35,000 native Irish emigrated from that island to Canada, the US, Australia, wherever, looking for work. If you look at that on an annual basis, that number of people leaving Ireland, if you look at it, by the year 2040, that will have reached over 740,000 people, 750,000. So the same number are leaving as they want to grow it by, or close to it. So what is the point? Why don't they provide jobs for their own people? And why don't they simultaneously stop importing what are now several thousand, at least several thousand immigrants a year into that island? And of course, there's a lot more to the story because many of them are not listed as immigrants. You have students who stay over their visas. You have people bringing kids in. You have all sorts of abuses of the system. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But these people that come are not just these victims of war. And that's the old sales pitch. How can you be so cruel? Well, how can the Irish government be so cruel to its own people who are actually living in the street while they are providing and giving jobs to these people. While 10%, nearly 450,000 Irish, are unemployed, the total population is 4.5 million Irish. As a matter of fact, 40% of the people working in Ireland between the ages of 20 and 40 are non-Irish. So all they're doing, this is population replacement. And that's all it is. They interviewed a lot of these people. They're not all from Syria, and they're not even all from North Africa. They're from lots of places in Africa. They're in lots of places from the Middle East. They're from Mexico. They're from South America. Loads of them are coming in from Poland, and they're from Turkey. Then they say that they're EU members, or they're coming in from member countries in the EU, like England or Holland. Well, it's very unlikely, as a matter of fact, it's impossible, actually, that the Dutch and the English are moving to Ireland to work. The people that are coming from those EU member countries are Africans, Asians, etc., etc. They interviewed one guy. It was kind of funny. This particular guy was from Argentina. The interview was asking him about his background and how he got to Ireland. Well, he left South America. He went to Israel and got married, and then he managed to work his way across Europe and landed in Ireland, and he liked it very much because there's a very generous welfare system there. So how is it this poor oppressed refugee, he can manage to travel all over the world, needs to go to Ireland and displace a native Irish from his job, his or her job? And of course the expense to the society is not just financial. It certainly is that, but it of course has to do with quality of life, as is the case in almost every Western country that I have looked at. It's a hands-off policy when it comes to the immigrants. For instance, there was a case of an immigrant who sexually assaulted a 10-year-old child. He was not deported. There was another one who was involved with a terrorist group. He was also not deported. And then there are, of course, the cases of welfare fraud. One of them was kind of funny. There was an interview being held with a woman, an African woman, and she had been claiming benefits both in the UK and in Ireland. So when the interviewer asked her, how about this? How about the double dipping? She just rolled her eyes, and she didn't understand. She didn't think she was committing fraud. I mean, do they really think these people are that stupid? And then she goes ahead and says, well, everybody's doing it. So he jumps on it and says, you want to talk about that a little bit? Everybody's doing it. So anyway, not everybody is doing it, but plenty are. There is even a racket where one resident, EU resident, that means anybody from anywhere, decides to leave Ireland, let's say, and go back to Holland or back home to Africa or to London. They sell their PPS number, which means they're the number that qualifies them to receive benefits, welfare benefits from the Irish government. They sell these or rent them. I mean, it's a racket. And these people are sophisticated. They're working the system. They know exactly what they're doing. Another analyst of the situation pointed out the current push for abortion on demand. It is interesting that a country that wants to grow its population by 1 million people starts pushing for abortion. And starts pushing for abortion simultaneous with pushing for uncontrolled immigration, because it is going to become that. Because the pressures will continue. As people have said, okay, what was the original excuse? Well, this excuse was they need workers. But then it becomes simultaneously, we have to take in the poor victims of war. So I would like you to either get on any internet and start looking, any internet outlet, and start looking for these videos. They're being shot not only in Ireland, I've put some on the page with this story, but all over Europe, of these immigrants coming in and tossing the food back at their They're victimizers. The people running the refugee camps, they don't like it. It's not good enough. One guy actually said, he actually said this, I can't eat this. This food's disgusting. This is for a dog or a woman. Anyway, busting through barricades, tossing things at the cops, absolutely destroying trains, leaving them in shambles. These are victims? And then there was a couple of them were funny. One of them was complaining because he couldn't bring a girl in. He said it was too crowded. Didn't have enough privacy. And another one, he was complaining. He said that he was bored. As a matter of fact, he was a refugee in Greece, but he got bored, so then he decided to keep moving. Victims? Really? Which isn't to say there aren't legitimate victims of the perpetual war in the Middle East. So then the good lefties get up and say, but we have to stop the war. The Western imperialist powers, that's a load of you-know-what. Nobody in Britain or Europe at all is ever going to say the word Israel, or only a tiny number. So that's the problem, and everybody's talking around it. Even the people pushing for immigration control, of course, are so utterly intimidated because, God forbid, you should say anything that might be interpreted as slightly racist. As a matter of fact, there was a hearing, I guess, in the Irish government at the Joint Committee on Justice, Defence and Equality. The government interviewed the immigration control platform run by two individuals, Annie Connell and Ted Neville, and their position is anti-immigration. And then before the meeting started, it's just really fascinating to watch this stuff. Representatives of the government and the pro-immigration stance read in the Riot Act. They are told they cannot criticize any individual, name any entity. So in other words, you can't criticize a group of people and you can't criticize anybody individually. So right there, before you get out of the starting gate, they've hobbled you. But that's part of the game. So the two were excellent. They really were. Very reasonable, very fair-minded, very clear in their explanations. All the government reps could do was call them names, basically. One of the characters in there was funny. I suddenly realized, wait, she's an American. What's she doing in the Irish government? Does she have an Irish last name? Is she an expat? No. She's got, what was her name? Kathleen Zappone. So she was particularly head up about the horrors of people who would even consider an anti-immigration stance. So that was it. I mean, besides, I think somebody tried to bring up the big H. Maybe not. It gets brought up no matter what the situation is. But another woman there was funny. She was Irish, and she was very head up and offended that they would take such a stance. And then she said, but you've convinced me to continue to promote immigration. And she brought up the fact that a friend or family member had been forced to emigrate, that is, to leave Ireland. And it was because this person had been forced to emigrate, she was going to be a pro-immigration supporter, which is completely insane. I mean, the reason this friend or family member had been forced to leave Ireland was because of the immigration, these masses of people being brought in. And now the lovely Isle is beginning to experience the same thing Americans have lived with for years, which is violence in the streets. There are a number of videos. They're on this page too. Check them out. And Native Irish are just being attacked, just willfully attacked by gangs, large groups, particularly of African youth. The youth word. Yes. So, where are the cops? Or the Garda? Nowhere to be seen? No, not exactly, but they do tend to stand down and watch. So obviously they've been given orders to kick back and not to be too hard on the youth. Then in addition, the Garda are becoming, well, less Irish. There's a nice little cute little looking Chinese girl in a cop's uniform, and somebody else looked more Middle Eastern. So it's important, yes. The diversity thing, that applies to the police as well as it does in all the Western nations. So another excuse for allowing all these immigrants in is that there was mass emigration from Ireland in the middle of the 19th century due to what people commonly call the famine. It was actually genocide. But as one of these two speakers pointed out, well, the fact that the government didn't manage to take care of its citizens in the 19th century is no excuse to justify it not taking care of its own citizens in the early 21st century, is it? So anyway, this government meeting wraps up by the government reps calling the two reps of the anti-immigration position as being out of touch and racist. Yeah, that's a fallback position. That is their only position. So it wrapped up, but it's really interesting to see, for one thing, the Irish are beginning to respond. There are a lot of remarks on different sites that, oh, well, they're out drinking in the pubs. So they're not, but I would be, would you? And, of course, there's a government advertising program pushing the whole agenda, the Ireland 2040 agenda, where, of course, they use kids. Yes, the old emotional manipulations, and using young children, of course, where they place the one little white, red-haired, blue-eyed, blonde Irish child next to, of course, an African, Asian, Middle Easterner. Always, always, always. You cannot see a white child anymore in this world without seeing a child of another ethnic background right next to him. In Ireland, they call them undocumented migrants, whilst in the U.S., they call them undocumented immigrants. Same term, basically. So you think this isn't a global agenda? Of course it is. That phrase in itself is something I want to take a look at. Why, oh why do we have so many undocumented immigrants? And I've come up with a very simple answer to that. Because you can't count them. If they're not documented, you don't even know they're there. And that's part of this game. Because there are lots more than the numbers the government is willing to put out. 1 year you hear it's 2,000, then it's 4,000. And, of course, that's only certain people in certain categories. Then there's the asylum category, another category. And then there are the students, and that's another category. And the other obvious intent that this is really about population replacement is that the émigrés, those Irish that leave Ireland, are obviously of working age and of the age to have families. And the people coming into Ireland are of that age. So as far as the so-called economic migrants, they'll come in with families. And then you have this mass of so-called war refugees, young men. Where are the women and children? Again and again, where are the women and children? So on one talk show I heard, that was dated from the end of 2016, the good-hearted person was recommending just, opening the gates basically, and another said, well, they would take in 4,000 by 2018. That's 4,000 a year. So that too is going to change the society. Because, as with every change in the law, it sets precedent. It's very hard to go backwards. And these people know that are pushing for this, the open borders thing, which really does and doesn't have anything to do with the war in the Middle East. Certainly the war in the Middle East is creating refugees with the intention, and this is very much the intention, the Zionist intention to clear the Middle East for themselves and then send these people into Europe. Nobody will say that, of course. They'll talk about Western imperialism. And I want to read an interesting response on this website to the subject of who these refugees really are. And the writer says, most of these migrants coming to Europe from Africa are not refugees. They are economic migrants from countries such as Morocco, Algeria, Nigeria, Congo, Liberia, Sudan, etc. These countries are not war zones, and the vast majority of them are men of military age. Where are the women and the kids? Europe can't afford to bail out the whole of Africa. If this people smuggling is allowed to continue, then hundreds of millions of African migrants will attempt to make the same journey. Meanwhile, the real refugees in Syria and Iraq will be left behind. Idiots like this Cunningham chap really have no idea what they're talking about. And here's another one. Wexford County Council has a welcome policy for refugees, but when the Irish homeless people go up there to hold peaceful assembly in Wexford Council offices, they are told they must leave and the Garda are called. So there you go, the police in Western nations targeting their own populations while leaving the immigrants alone. And here's another instance that I heard described on a YouTube video. Now, FGM, we all know about FGM. There were 5,000 cases of this in Ireland. 5,000 cases of female genital mutilation. And none of them were prosecuted. But as the speaker was pointing out, if an Irish person slaps their own child in the street, they'll be arrested. Prejudice? Or maybe it's just time for a new campaign. Just say no to FGM. One subject that was brought up on a talk show was the fact that the Irish Navy were out in the Mediterranean helping to save some of these victims of their own people. This is the point. These Africans that fall into the sea, many drown because the human traffickers are their own people, sticking them in these shoddy vessels. So then the Irish Navy, which should be around the coast of Ireland, is off in the Mediterranean helping to save these people. And of course, it's a concern. Yes, good-hearted people are going to care, but the fact of the matter is, if the Europeans would take a stance and just say no to uncontrolled immigration, then these people would learn that there is no point in risking their lives to get to a place where they're going to be turned around and sent back. And that would help stop putting an end, or at least starting to put an end, to this human trafficking racket. And it is a global racket. As a matter of fact, in the U.S., the Chinese have been doing this, shipping their own people in here in the same god-awful circumstances and charging them thousands of dollars a head to get them into the U.S. illegally. I did a study on this in one of the audio files I did on China. So it's huge. It's all over the world. And these people are the victims of their own nationals. And it's expensive. It costs $3,500 a head to deport any illegal immigrant that shows up on the shores of Ireland. And then there's a cost of using their own navy to be out in the Mediterranean. And who is pushing for this? Why, it's their Prime Minister of Ireland, Leo Varadkar, except for the fact that the Prime Minister of Ireland is not, in fact, Irish. He is a half-Indian homosexual. I don't think he'll be celebrating St. Paddy's Day. Do you? As a matter of fact, there is an article on the internet about Pence going over there to talk to the Prime Minister of Ireland, and the conversation was about money, as usual, about trade, and this Prime Minister wanted closer economic ties and no economic barriers. I wonder if absolute open trade and no tariffs would benefit a small country like Ireland. Meanwhile, the United States is setting up tariffs. I once heard a man say that it's not the conclusions that are reached that are so startling, it's the assumptions that those conclusions are based on that are so startling. So, what am I talking about? The assumption that I'm talking about is the very idea that a nation of 4.5 million people, a small island nation like Ireland, should in any way be responsible for what goes on the African continent. There are close to 1 billion people in Africa. Ireland can't in any way be expected to absorb this huge population or any percentage thereof. So now we come to the subject of the war machine. Yes, the arms trade, the arms racket, the international, endless profiteering from arms is a large part of this. But aren't the African nations who go to war with each other, aren't the African tribes that set upon one another, aren't they responsible for their own behavior? And why can this be pushed off on the Irish? Even the poverty. Ireland has its own situation to deal with. It can't take on the Africans or the Asians or the Middle East. And that's another part of this argument that's always used. Well, England and France helped to bomb Libya and take out Gaddafi. Yes, they did. What has that got to do with the Irish? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Ireland never colonized anything. So that argument just falls down altogether. But they are being set up. This president wants to have the Irish military join this EU military. So therein lies a trap, because they will be expected to go off on the wars, and then they will be held responsible, and that's part of the setup. I want to wrap this up by talking about another beleaguered, very small group of Europeans with the exact same number, and I'm talking about the white South Africans. 4.5 million of them, 4.5 million Irish. Small groups of people who cannot really defend themselves against these global powers and networks. Now, in South Africa, they are actively being genocided. Julius Malema has actually made the statement, and he's the leader of EFF. He has actually made the statement that they won't be genociding the Boers right now. But what they are calling for is complete land distribution, taking all the land, all the farms from the white farmers in South Africa and taking them actually for the government of South Africa. So what is my point here? Very, very important point. Without land, you don't have a country, and that's exactly what they're doing in South Africa. They're setting up the Boers, they're setting up the white South Africans, so they simply have no recognition politically. You can't start a state without land. In the case of the Irish, you can't keep a state if you don't have land. So this invasion, which is intended to displace them, to turn the Irish into a minority in their own country within less than 25 years, and it's well on its way, they're obviously going to put the numbers up of the immigrants in the years ahead, will in effect give the Irish no status as a people. And several African leaders have made the statement that no whites in Africa. Africa is for black people. But at the same time, white countries, white European countries, small white European countries, are for Africans. Double standard? Woo! So I imagine it's not a very happy St. Patrick's Day for the Irish, but at least they're beginning to see what is really being done to them.